Czech Republic's shining citadel. Celebrated by poets and kings, Prague is considered one of the world's most beautiful cities. Its vibrant history has an appeal even for Czech college students.
People, consider Prague to be a special place for historical reasons and its architecture. But I live here, so I don't really kind of absorb or think about these things.
Prague today is, I would say, one of the best places where you can live, as a young person especially. It's a city with a long history.
One of my favorite writers is Franz Kafka, and so going through the same streets as he did is just a good feeling.
But Prague also has a dark side.
If we hide it forever, it will remain a cancer in the organism of the society.
Today, Prague, Czech Republic is a thriving society. It's a democracy. But a couple of decades ago, at this very place, there was still this monstrous communist regime.
Czechoslovaks suffered 40 years of communist tyranny. In this era of fear and compromise, a majority of citizens fell silent, while those wishing to get ahead did so by sacrificing others. Dissidents speaking out against the communist system, such as the outlaw playwright Václav Havel, were severely punished. Then, in 1989, students in Prague sparked a bloodless revolution and achieved what had once seemed impossible.
Přátelé, pravda a svoboda musí zvítězit.
But when the euphoria subsided, many questions about the country's dark past and the roles people played remained unanswered. Haunting questions, which still linger today.
People are forgetting what happened.
It's not just a problem of the of parents, but it's also a problem of the school. That's what's bothering me.
People really don't trust each other, and maybe it is for a reason. I don't know if people can be trusted. They don't believe in any ideals. They turn everything into a farce. And maybe this has really to do with the communist past.
After the Second World War and the defeat of the Nazis in Eastern Europe, tensions flared in Czechoslovakia when free elections produced a communist-led government. Anxieties spread that Czechoslovakia's Western-style democracy might be in peril. 2 years later, those fears were realized when the communist-led majority engineered a coup.
It's easier than you think to slip into a situation where you're governed by people who do not respect the fundamental ground rules of democracy, and in fact use democracy as a way of destroying it.
Having seized power, Czechoslovak communists aligned themselves with Soviet Russia and isolated the nation behind the Iron Curtain. Under Soviet influence, Czechoslovak communists demonized America and her West European allies.
You have two blocks facing each other. You have the imperialist bloc, Western bloc led by United States, and then you had the so-called progressive, peace-loving bloc that led by the Soviet Union, and to which Czechoslovakia was annexed.
After the coup, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia instituted strict censorship and closed the country's borders.
Before the war, people were going back and forth to Paris, to London, to wherever, suddenly, you have the Iron Curtain and no possibility of leaving the country. So not only you have the oppression of the regime, but also you're trapped, you can't leave it.
The regime, of course, wanted absolute control over everything.
Control over everything included even the most trivial details of daily life. Yosef Yarab was a schoolboy when the communists came to power.
I was nearly kicked out of the grammar school when I wore striped socks. And striped socks was considered something Western, not accepted. So I was called into the headmaster and he told me, "Do you really understand what you're doing?" Well, I just feel like wearing striped socks because I like striped socks, And, well, I had to more or less sort of promise that I would not wear them.
The consequences were much more severe for adults. All over the country, people were arrested without cause and charged with subversion. Denied a proper defense, many, including women, were hauled before public tribunals, branded as traitors and sent to prison. Some were even executed.
You could very well have gone to jail for 10 years or gone to the salt mines or the uranium mines or been shot. It was brutal.
Those caught trying to flee the country risked sharing a similar fate. Years later, in the 1960s, a faction in the regime led by Alexander Dubček wagered that without reform the Communist Party would remain unpopular and despised by the majority of society. When these reform communists came to power in 1968, they introduced sweeping changes. It was the beginning of the Prague Spring.
For the party reformers, that was the most important break with the 50s, with the Stalinist period.
The main goals of the Prague Spring were to really renew the Communist Party as a legitimate group of people who were leading society. And who were basically saying to the country, without saying it literally, "We're sorry. We made a lot of mistakes. We've kind of ruined this country. We're going to give it back to you."
For the reformers, giving the country back to its people meant the lifting of one of the party's most sensitive policies, censorship.
The big debate in the party then was, how far should we go in allowing others to voice their own views about what the Prague Spring should be about? Because, you abolish censorship, which is what they did at the beginning of 1968, and from then on, you're no longer in control of things.
This was an exceptionally vivid and wonderful time for my life.
In the late 1960s, Ivana Doležalova was a teenager living in Prague.
Even at our high school in the early 60s, we could suddenly start talking about things that were not allowed to talk about before. We could start wearing jeans, for example, which still in the second grade of high school were forbidden. And there were so many wonderful things that one could go to. And I went to see every single film and theater performance in the country because it just was possible.
There's a new wave of Czechoslovak cinema. There is Czech theater.
It was a huge outburst of creative energy in this society.
One of the artists gaining popularity in Czechoslovakia was a daring young playwright named Václav Havel. Possessed by a desire to challenge a regime that lied to its people, Havel wrote plays exposing the absurdity of communism.
Dobré věci má dělat prostě proto, že si myslí, že jsou dobré, že jsou v souladu s jeho svědomím, že nemá pocit zalepkanosti nějakými kompromisy, úhyby, mlčením k nějakému zlu.
In a society still terrified by its past, Havel's plays showed the communist regime for what it was and gave hope that the nightmare would soon end.
I went often to the theater on the balustrade to see Havel's plays that were staged at the time. And for me it was just something amazing.
Václav Havel is obviously one of the key figures in the 1960s revival, but he's probably also one of the most politically savvy members of the intellectual counterculture.
In 1968, Havel gained notoriety in the West when his play The Memorandum was performed in New York. Just as American audiences were being exposed to plays written in the Eastern Bloc, the lifting of censorship gave Czechoslovak citizens access to imported Western culture.
All the international best directors like Bergman and Bertolucci and Fellini and so on were in the cinemas, in the art clubs.
So I think for ordinary citizens that was it. Freedom of speech, freedom to address all the issues of the past, and also freedom to travel.
You could suddenly go and travel and move freely and hitchhike throughout Europe, which at the time hitchhiking was great fun.
While many Czechoslovaks passionately embraced their newfound freedoms, others were more cautious.
We thought that our prospects were much better than the prospects for our parents.
Zuzana Manishova was a 17-year-old high school student in 1968.
But still, everyone was afraid there might be a strict reaction from the Soviets.
Once you abolish censorship, once you allow people to travel freely, once you allow also people to organize independently, this is basically you have undermined all the basic tenets of what the communist system was about. The Czechs thought, well, we are still doing it within the framework of socialism. We want to humanize socialism, make it more palatable to people, and we're going to get acceptance.
But in Moscow, things were seen a bit differently.
I was woken up like, I don't know, 11, 12 at night. Somebody called, Russians are here.
And I started shivering and I couldn't stop the shivering, so I was terribly afraid.
At 11 p.m. on the night of August 20th, 1968, Czechoslovakia was invaded. The estimates were between 250,000 and 500,000 troops, including support troops. That's total military occupation.
Once inside the capital city of Prague, Soviet forces took up positions in front of government buildings, including the offices of Czechoslovak Public Radio.
When we were crossing the street where the Czech radio